Elias Boone leaned into the blizzard. Snow slashed his beard. The trapline rope cut deep into the scar where a bear once tried to take his arm. Pain never left that mountain. Then a shape collapsed in the drift ahead. A woman. Dress torn. Hands bound. A thin chain glinting at her throat. "Help. Please." Elias cut the rope and lifted her. Then the wind shifted the pendant against his glove. And Elias Boone felt the world stop. Because the ring hanging from her neck was his. And his life was about to change forever. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Snow swallowed the trail behind Elias Boone. The wind howled down the ridge like a wounded animal. He leaned forward against it, boots sinking deep in drifts that reached his knees. The woman in his arms barely weighed anything. Too light. Too cold. Her breath brushed weak against the thick fur over his shoulder. The mountain man pushed through the last line of pine. His cabin appeared through the storm like a shadow pressed against the slope. Rough logs. Low roof buried in snow. Smoke on cold from the chimney. Elias kicked the door open with his boot. The cabin answered with darkness. He stepped inside and slammed the door against the wind. Silence followed. Only the storm scratching at the walls. Elias crossed the room in 3 long strides. The woman's boots dragged against the floorboards. Frozen leather scraping wood. He laid her beside the stone hearth. Then he moved. No wasted motion. A split log from the crate. Kindling. Steel against flint. One spark. Then another. The fire caught slow. Orange light crawled across the cabin walls. The warmth came late. Elias knelt beside the woman and cut the rope around her wrists with his hunting knife. The cords fell loose. Her hands were purple from the cold. Bruised. He watched her for a long moment. Still breathing. Barely. The mountain man stood and filled a kettle from the snow barrel. Metal clanged softly as he set it above the growing flames. Behind him the woman stirred. A thin sound escaped her throat. Not quite a word. Elias turned. Her eyes opened halfway. Gray. Clouded with pain. She tried to sit. Failed. The chain at her throat shifted across her collarbone. Firelight caught the ring hanging from it. Gold. Worn smooth. Elias froze. The room went very quiet. He stepped closer. Slow. The woman followed his movement with tired eyes. Her voice came out rough. "Don't. Send me back." Elias said nothing. His large hand closed around the pendant. The ring felt heavy against his palm. Familiar. Too familiar. A memory flashed across his mind like lightning over snow. A cabin burned years ago. Blood on the ground. A woman screaming his name in the dark. Elias released the chain. The woman flinched slightly. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin again. Snow rattled the shutters. Elias rose to his full height. The fire cracked behind him. He walked to the door and slid the heavy bar across it. Wood thudded into place. The woman watched him from the hearth. Fear and exhaustion tangled in her face. Elias turned back toward her. His voice came low. Quiet as falling snow. "You stayed the night." The kettle began to whistle softly over the flames. Elias poured hot water into a tin cup. He knelt beside her again and held it out. The woman hesitated, then wrapped both shaking hands around the cup. Warmth touched her face. Elias studied her quietly. Torn coat. Mud on the hem. Rope marks still fresh on her wrists. This woman had been running. From something. Or someone. The wind outside shifted direction. A long distant sound rolled through the mountains. Not thunder. Hooves. Faint. Far down the valley trail. Elias Boone lifted his head slightly. Listening. The storm hid many things, but riders could still find a cabin in the snow. Morning came slow to the mountain. Gray light pressed through the frost on the cabin window. The storm had quieted. Only wind now, long and low across the ridge. Elias Boone was already awake. He stood outside splitting wood beside the cabin wall, bare chest steaming in the cold air, muscles flexing under weathered skin as the axe rose and fell. Thud. A clean split. Another log rolled into the growing stack. Inside the cabin the fire had burned low. Mary Whitlock woke to the smell of pine smoke and iron. For a moment she did not move, just listened. The steady rhythm outside. Axe against wood. Strong. Unhurried. She pushed herself upright slowly. The blanket slid from her shoulders. Warmth still clung to the room. Her eyes drifted to the door, then to the ring resting against her collarbone. Her fingers touched it gently. A habit, old as the pain behind it. The cabin door opened. Cold air rushed in. Elias stepped inside carrying 2 armfuls of split logs. Snow clung to his boots. He dropped the wood beside the hearth. The fire woke again when he fed it. Flames rising. Light returning to the room. Mary watched him quietly. The man moved like part of the mountain. Strong. Silent. He poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. Steam curled between them. She accepted it with both hands. Their fingers did not touch. "You ride out today?" she asked softly. Elias shook his head once. Storm still owned the trails. He sat at the rough table and began repairing a torn trapline rope. Thick fingers moving careful through the knots. Mary studied the room while she drank. Pelts stacked along the wall. Steel traps drying by the fire. A rifle hanging above the door. Simple living. Hard living. Then her gaze drifted to the far corner. A wooden shelf. Dusty. Almost forgotten. A small box sat there. Beside it, a framed photograph. Mary stood slowly and crossed the room. The floor creaked beneath her boots. Elias did not look up, but his hand slowed slightly. Mary lifted the photograph. The glass was cracked along one edge. Inside stood a younger Elias Boone. Same broad shoulders. Same thick beard. But his eyes were different. Warmer. Beside him stood a woman. Dark hair. Kind smile. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. Mary stared at the image, then at the ring resting against her throat. A quiet realization settled in her chest. Behind her the rope snapped tight in Elias's grip. The sound was sharp. Mary turned. He was standing now, still as stone. His eyes locked on the photograph in her hand. She placed it back on the shelf carefully. The silence stretched between them. Heavy. Old. Mary spoke carefully. "She was your wife." Elias said nothing. His gaze shifted to the fire. Flame snapped against the iron kettle. Finally he stepped past her and opened the wooden box. Inside lay a strip of burned cloth. Blackened lace. A piece of something that once belonged to a dress. Elias held it a moment, then set it back inside. "Fiancé," he said quietly. The word carried weight. Years of it. Mary watched the man's shoulders rise with a slow breath. Elias crossed the room and took his coat from the peg. The heavy fur fell across his shoulder. His eyes drifted once toward the ring at Mary's neck. Pain flashed there. Fast. Gone just as quick. "She died winter 6 years back," he said. His voice stayed low. Controlled. Cabin burned. Mary felt the room grow colder despite the fire. "Men came for supplies," he continued. "Gold rumor. They thought I had it." His jaw tightened. "They took everything." The wind pushed against the cabin walls. Elias walked to the door. His hand rested on the wood. "They took that ring too." Mary's fingers tightened around the chain at her throat. Her voice barely rose above the fire. "I didn't steal it." Elias turned. His eyes studied her face. Searching. Mary reached behind her neck and unclasped the chain. The ring slipped into her palm. She held it out. "Bandits robbed the wagon I was traveling with," she said quietly. 3 winters ago. The memory shadowed her voice. "They killed the driver." Her hand trembled slightly. "One of them tossed this at me." Elias did not move. He said it once belonged to a mountain man who wouldn't need it anymore. The fire popped sharply. Outside, the wind carried a distant echo. Something faint on the valley trail. Mary saw Elias hear it before she did. His head tilted slightly. Listening. Hooves. Far away. But real. The mountain man stepped to the rifle above the door and lifted it from its hooks. The wood creaked softly in his grip. Mary followed his gaze toward the window. White snow. Empty trail. For now. Elias glanced once more at the ring resting in her open palm. The past had found its way back to his cabin. And somewhere out there in the frozen valley, men were still riding. The wind died with the night. Morning crept over the mountains in pale silver light. Elias Boone stood outside the cabin door, rifle resting against his shoulder. The valley below lay buried under fresh snow. Wide. Still. Too still. His breath rolled from his beard in slow clouds. Boot tracks led away from the cabin yard. Mary's. He followed them with his eyes. They ended near the wood pile. She was there. Splitting kindling. The axe was too large for her. The handle wobbled in her hands. But she kept swinging. Thud. The blade struck crooked. The wood barely cracked. Mary lifted the axe again. Her wrists trembled. She swung harder. The log split this time. Half of it rolled into the snow. Elias watched in silence. She did not notice him yet. Her coat hung loose on her thin shoulders. The storm had taken more from her than sleep. He stepped forward. Boots crunching. Mary turned. Her breath caught for a moment. Then she straightened and pushed the loose hair from her face. "I figured the fire would need feeding," she said. Elias picked up one of the split pieces and stacked it beside the door. Then another. And another. Mary lifted the axe again. Elias took it from her hand. The tool looked smaller in his grip. One swing. Clean split. He handed her the smaller pieces. She carried them inside. Back and forth. Wood. Snow. Warmth. The cabin slowly filled with the scent of fresh pine. Later the fire burned steady again. Mary knelt near the hearth stirring a pot of beans. Elias sat near the table sharpening his hunting knife. Steel whispered against stone. Neither spoke. Outside the sky cleared slowly. Sunlight glinted across the frozen valley. Mary glanced toward the door. "You ride out when the trail opens?" she asked. Elias did not look up. Eventually. The knife edge flashed once more. Mary stirred the pot again. Steam rose around her face. She spoke carefully. "I can leave when the storm breaks." The knife stopped. Silence. Elias set the blade on the table. His eyes lifted toward the window. Snow still clung deep along the ridges. Avalanche country. Cold enough to kill a traveler in hours. "You'd die out there," he said quietly. Mary did not answer. She already knew. The fire popped softly. Elias stood and pulled his fur coat across his shoulder. He stepped outside again. Mary followed a moment later. The valley stretched wide below them. White fields. Black lines of pine. The trail twisted through it like a scar. Elias crouched near the edge of the yard. His fingers brushed the snow. Tracks. Horse tracks. Old. Half buried by the storm. But real. Mary stepped closer. "You expecting riders?" Elias stood slowly. No. He studied the trail again. The riders had passed days earlier. Maybe more. Still. They had come this far into the mountains. That meant trouble somewhere below. Mary watched his face. The mountain man said nothing. But she saw the tension in his jaw. The quiet calculation. The same look men wore when danger had already begun moving. Back inside the cabin, Elias pulled a rolled hide map from the shelf. He spread it across the table. Mary stood beside him. The map showed rivers, pass trails, trading posts, tiny marks carved by years of travel. Elias tapped one location. Towns here. His finger moved higher into the mountains. Cabins here. Mary studied the distance. Days of travel. Hard ones. Snow still thick across the passes. Elias rolled the map again. His voice came slow. You stay till the thaw. Mary blinked once. He continued. Work for food. Help with trapline. Mary's eyes lowered slightly. And when spring comes, you ride down valley. The words were plain. Simple. No promises in them. Only time. Mary nodded slowly. That's fair. Elias stepped to the shelf and lifted the small wooden box. He opened it. Inside rested the burned lace. And an empty space where the ring once belonged. He closed the lid again. The sound was quiet. Final. Mary removed the chain from her pocket. She set the ring carefully on the table. The gold glowed softly in the firelight. Elias stared at it a long moment. Then slid it back toward her. Keep it. Mary hesitated. It belongs to you. Elias shook his head once. Not anymore. Outside, the wind shifted across the valley. A long distant echo drifted through the mountains. Mary turned toward the door. Hooves. Faint. Very far away. But moving closer along the valley trail. Elias Boone heard them too. And the temporary peace inside the cabin suddenly felt very thin. The mountain settled into rhythm. Morning came cold. Gray light over snow. Elias Boone stepped outside before sunrise. Breath steaming. A bundle of steel traps hung from his shoulder. Mary followed a few steps behind. Boots stiff. Hands buried in borrowed gloves. The valley still slept under frost. Elias knelt near the tree line and drove a trap stake into the frozen earth. One strike. Two. Metal teeth waited in the snow beside a thin trail where rabbits passed at night. Mary crouched beside him. Watching. Here? She asked. Elias nodded once. She packed snow over the trap carefully. Learning. Slow. Careful. They moved along the ridge, setting the rest. The wind whispered through the pines. A hawk circled high above the valley. By the time the sun broke across the peaks, the trapline was set. Elias turned toward the cabin. Mary followed. Neither spoke. But the silence felt different now. Less like distance. More like work shared. Inside the cabin, Mary shook snow from her coat and fed the fire. Flames licked up through the logs. Warmth spread through the room. She filled the kettle. Cut dried meat. Dropped beans into the pot. The cabin slowly filled with the smell of broth. Elias cleaned the traps near the door. Snow melted off the steel. Water dripped across the floorboards. Mary glanced toward the shelf. The wooden box still sat there. Undisturbed. But the photograph beside it had been moved. Elias had set it upright again. Facing the room. A small thing. But she noticed. Later that afternoon, Elias returned from the ridge carrying a snowshoe hare. Mary met him at the door. She took the animal without hesitation. Knife already waiting. You want the hide? She asked. Elias nodded. She worked with steady hands. The blade slid clean. The hide peeled away without tearing. Elias watched quietly. "You've done this before," he said. Mary rinsed her hands in a bucket of snowmelt. "My father trapped river lions back east." The words came simple. No pride in them. Just fact. Elias hung the cleaned meat beside the hearth. Mary stretched the hide across a wooden frame. The cabin felt busier now. Lived in. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge early. Winter days were short in the mountains. The fire grew brighter against the dark. Mary stirred the pot again. Steam rose thick. Elias sat near the table repairing a snowshoe strap. Leather creaked softly under his fingers. Mary studied the strap, then crossed the room. "Your knot's wrong." Elias looked up. Mary knelt beside him. Her fingers moved quick across the leather. Loop. Pull. Tight. The strap sat stronger now. Elias tested it once. Held. He nodded slightly. "Good knot." Mary smiled faintly. A small warmth crossed the room. The wind outside shifted. A sudden howl rolled down the valley. The cabin shutters rattled. Mary froze a moment. Storm again? Elias stepped to the window. The sky had turned darker. Clouds moving fast over the peaks. But that was not what held his attention. Tracks. Fresh ones. Crossing the open slope below the cabin. Horse tracks. 3. Maybe 4 riders. Mary stepped beside him. Her breath fogged the glass. Hunters? Elias shook his head slowly. Too high for hunters. The riders had passed the lower trail. They had climbed. Toward the ridge. Toward his land. The tracks disappeared into the timber farther down the valley. Gone. For now. Elias stepped away from the window. He lifted the rifle from its hooks above the door. Checked the chamber. Quiet. Routine. But Mary saw the tension in his shoulders. Later the storm finally arrived. Wind slammed snow against the cabin walls. Firelight flickered across the room. Mary sat near the hearth mending a torn glove. Elias carved wood beside the table. The small shape slowly became a spoon. The knife moved careful. Patient. Mary watched the work. "You've lived alone long?" she asked. Elias kept carving. "Long enough." Mary nodded slowly. The fire popped. Outside the storm roared harder. But inside the cabin warmth held. The spoon finished smooth under Elias's knife. He set it beside her on the table. "For stew," he said. Mary ran her fingers along the wood. A quiet gift. The first one. Neither said more. Outside, somewhere beyond the storm, riders moved through the mountains. And the peaceful rhythm inside Elias Boone's cabin had already begun to change. Dawn came sharp and bright over the ridge. The storm had blown itself empty in the night. Snow glittered hard under the rising sun. Elias Boone stood outside the cabin tightening the straps on his snowshoes. Mary stepped out behind him carrying a sack of dried meat for the trapline. Her breath drifted white in the morning air. The mountains looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Elias started down the ridge trail. Mary followed. The forest swallowed them quickly. Dull pine trunks. Long shadows. Only the crunch of snow beneath their feet. The first trap waited near the creek bend. Empty. Elias reset it. Mary packed the snow around the jaws. They moved on. At the second trap the wire line hung slack. Elias knelt. His fingers brushed the snow. The trap had been sprung. But not by an animal. The steel jaws were twisted open. Bent. Mary crouched beside him. "Bear?" she asked. Elias shook his head. He lifted the chain. The metal link had been cut clean. A knife job. Fresh. Mary felt the cold deepen around them. "Someone's been here." Elias said nothing. But he scanned the trees. The quiet forest suddenly felt watchful. They followed the trapline farther down the slope. 2 more traps were missing. Another broken. Tracks showed through the snow. Horse tracks. Boot prints beside them. Men. Mary swallowed. Trappers? Elias studied the marks longer. The riders had not checked the traps like trappers. They had torn them out. Destroyed them. He rose slowly. Snow creaked under his weight. Not trappers. The words came low. Flat. They continued along the trail. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke. Mary caught it too. She looked up. A thin column of gray drifted beyond the lower ridge. Elias moved faster. Snowshoes gliding over the crust. They crested the ridge together. Below them sat a small trading shack near the frozen creek crossing. Or what remained of it. Blackened logs. Collapsed roof. The place had burned. Mary stared at the ruins. That was a supply post. Elias nodded once. He had traded there before winter. Salt. Shot. Lamp oil. Now nothing remained but charred wood and ash. Elias walked down the slope toward it. The snow around the shack was churned with horse tracks. Many of them. Mary counted quickly. 6. Maybe 7 riders. The wind stirred the ashes softly. Elias stepped through the wreckage. His boot struck something beneath the snow. He bent and brushed the powder aside. A piece of cloth. Dark red. Torn from a coat. Mary recognized it. The man who ran the post wore that. Elias turned the fabric over. Dried blood crusted the edge. No body. Just the sign of one. Mary looked toward the tree line. The mountain suddenly felt very large. And very empty. Elias studied the ground carefully. More tracks. Heading south along the valley pass. He followed them a few yards. Then stopped. Something glinted in the snow. A brass cartridge casing. Fresh. Elias picked it up. Turned it between his fingers. Stamped on the base. A mark he recognized. Caleb O'Rourke's riders carried those rounds. Mary watched his face. You know them. Elias slid the casing into his coat pocket. They ride this valley sometimes. The words came quiet. But Mary heard what he did not say. They did more than ride. They owned fear wherever they went. The wind lifted snow across the burned shack. Mary looked toward the mountain trail leading back to the cabin. They'll come up here? Elias did not answer immediately. He studied the valley pass. The riders had followed the same road the stagecoach once traveled. The same road Mary had been taken from. Finally he turned. They might. They climbed back toward the ridge in silence. Snow creaked beneath each step. The trapline hung empty now. Broken. The forest watched them pass. When the cabin finally came into view, Mary felt relief spread through her chest. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. Warm. Safe. Or it had been. Elias stopped before the yard. His eyes narrowed. Mary followed his gaze. Tracks. Fresh ones. Horse tracks circling the cabin. Not many. 2 riders this time. They had come close. Close enough to see the door. Close enough to see the smoke. Mary's hand moved unconsciously toward the ring at her neck. Elias stepped forward slowly. He studied the snow beside the porch. One rider had dismounted. Boot prints. Heavy ones. They had stood there. Looking. Waiting. Then ridden away again. For now. Elias lifted his head and scanned the tree line. The mountains stretched quiet and wide around them. But somewhere beyond those ridges, men were already deciding to return. The cabin stayed quiet that night. Too quiet. Fire snapped low in the hearth. Wind pressed soft against the walls. Elias Boone sat at the table cleaning his rifle in the orange light. Mary mended a torn wool sleeve near the fire. Neither wasted words. But both listened. To the mountain. To the dark. To the feeling that the valley had started holding its breath. A board creaked beneath Elias as he stood. He crossed to the door and slid the iron bar tighter into place. Then checked the window shutters. Then the back wall where spare shot hung on pegs. Routine. Careful. Mary watched every movement. "You think they'll come tonight?" she asked. Elias shook his head once. "Not yet." That should have eased her. It did not. The answer carried something colder than fear. Certainty. Mary set the sleeve down and stared into the fire. Light moved across her face. Across the thin line of the chain at her throat. Elias saw her fingers touch the ring again. Same as before sleep. Same as before silence. A habit born from old pain. He sat back down and pushed a tin plate toward her. Cornbread. Rabbit stew. She ate slowly. Then stopped. Her eyes fixed on nothing. Far away now. Elias noticed. What? Mary swallowed. Her hands tightened around the spoon. "I know that brass mark." Elias's gaze lifted. "The cartridge." She nodded once. "The one from the burned post." The fire cracked sharply. Mary set the spoon down. 3 winters seemed to come back into her face all at once. The men who robbed our coach had rifles loaded with brass stamped like that. Elias said nothing. He let the silence hold. Mary drew a breath that shook a little before it steadied. There were 5 at first. Then 2 more rode out of the trees after the driver was dead. She stared into the fire, but she was not seeing flames anymore. She was seeing snow. And blood. And one of them kept talking. Elias leaned forward slightly. Talking how? Like he wanted to be heard. Her voice dropped. Boasting. The room seemed smaller now. The cabin warmer. The memory colder. Mary rose and crossed to the kettle. Not because she wanted water. Because she needed to move. Steam curled around her face as she poured. Her hands trembled only once. She set the cup down and looked toward the window. He said they had buried the real hall where no lawman would freeze enough to follow. Elias stood. Slow. His boots made almost no sound on the floorboards. Mary turned toward him. He laughed about it. Her eyes lifted to his. Said the mountain kept better watch than any man. The wind outside dragged snow across the roof. A dry whisper. Elias's jaw hardened. Did he say where? Mary closed her eyes for a moment. Trying to hear the voice again. Not the words alone. The rhythm. The place. Then she opened them. There was a name. Elias waited. She moved to the table and took his hide map from the shelf. Spread it flat beside the lamp. Her finger drifted over the passes. The frozen creek. The lower timber. Then stopped near a narrow bend west of the valley. Red Widow Notch. The words landed like iron. Elias looked down at the map. His face changed. Not outwardly. Not much. But Mary saw it. A memory had just put its hand around his throat. That place caves in every thaw, he said. Mary nodded. He said that was the point. The lamp flame flickered. Elias placed both hands on the table and stared at the mark. Red Widow Notch sat between cliffs and pine choke. Half trail. Half grave. No rancher went there in winter. No sheriff either. The snow covered everything. Even sin. Mary reached into her coat pocket. There's more. She pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. Elias frowned. Mary unfolded it. A brass coat button. Dark with age. Stamped with a rearing horse inside a circle. Elias took it from her palm. His fingers closed hard. Where'd you get this? From the coach floor. She kept her voice low. One of the men tore his coat climbing down after the driver fought back. She paused. I kept it because I thought someday it might matter. Elias turned the button toward the firelight. The mark was worn, but not gone. He knew it. Rourke's men had once ridden with matching coats when they worked freight security before turning outlaw. A badge before they became wolves. Mary saw the thought reach him. That mark means something. Elias slipped the button into his pocket beside the cartridge casing. It ties them together. The fire popped again. Outside, something thudded against the wall. Both of them turned. Elias had the rifle in hand before the second sound came. A loose branch. Scraped by wind. Nothing more. Still, he moved to the door and listened a long moment before lowering the barrel. When he turned back, Mary was standing straighter now. Not less afraid. Just clearer. As if speaking the memory aloud had changed it from nightmare into weapon. Elias returned to the table. Looked at the map again. Then at Mary. "You should have told me sooner." There was no anger in it. Only the hard weight of time lost. Mary took that hit without flinching. "I wasn't sure until today." She touched the cartridge mark he had set beside the lamp. "Not until I saw that." Elias held her gaze. Then nodded once. Enough. No blame. Only the next step. He rolled the map shut and tied it tight. Fed another log into the fire. Warmth spread. But the room no longer felt sheltered. Now it felt prepared. Mary gathered the mending from her chair and set it aside. Neither of them sat again. Outside, night thickened around the cabin. Inside, truth had just opened a trail through the dark. And for the first time since the ring touched his hand, Elias Boone was no longer waiting for the mountain to decide his fate. The strike came before dawn. Not with a shout. Not with gunfire. With smoke. Mary woke first. The smell hit before her eyes opened. Sharp. Bitter. Wrong. She threw off the blanket and saw it at once. Orange light moving where no fire should be. Not in the hearth. Outside the window. Elias. He was already up. Boots hitting the floor. Rifle in one hand. Knife in the other. He reached the door in 2 strides and pulled it open. Cold air rushed in hard. Smoke rolled with it. Mary followed to the threshold and saw the lower shed burning beyond the wood pile. Flames climbed dry timber. Fast. Hungry. The trapline shed. Pelts. Salt. Winter stores. Everything inside feeding the blaze. Elias was moving before she drew breath. He grabbed the water buckets by the porch and ran straight through the snow. Bareheaded. Broad shoulders cutting through firelight and storm dark. Mary seized the second pail and followed. The cold bit through her boots at once. Snow up to the ankle. Then the shin. She reached the pump barrel beside the cabin wall. Ice crusted thick across the top. She smashed it with a hatchet left nearby. Filled one pail. Then another. By the time she stumbled to the shed, Elias had already thrown a blanket over the smaller side window to choke the draft. Fire snapped through the roof slats above him. A beam cracked. He did not flinch. Mary passed him the first bucket. Water hissed against flame. Steam burst up. Another bucket. Then another. Not enough. Never enough. The fire had been set well. Oil. She could smell it now beneath the pine smoke. Oil and spite. Elias tore the door open with one arm and ducked inside before she could stop him. Elias. The name ripped out of her. No answer. Only the roar of fire swallowing wood. Mary grabbed the next bucket and ran to the doorway. Heat slammed into her face. Inside the shed, Elias moved through smoke like a dark shape inside hell. He came out carrying 2 sacks over one shoulder. Flour. Shot. Then went back in again. Mary wanted to grab him. To drag him clear. But the look on his face stopped her. This was not a man saving things. This was a man refusing to lose another home to fire. The next beam gave way. Sparks shot into the black sky. Elias emerged hard and fast with a crate of traps in both hands. His beard singed at one edge. Smoke blackened his chest. Mary dropped her bucket and seized the crate from one side. Together they dragged it through the snow just as half the roof collapsed. The sound rolled across the valley like a cannon. Then came the horses. Not near. Not close enough to see. But there. Somewhere beyond the timber. Hooves moving slow. Watching. Mary straightened, chest heaving. Elias turned toward the tree line. Rifle up. Flames painted his face in red and gold. The woods stayed dark. No riders showed themselves. Just the sound of them shifting out there. Patient. Certain. A laugh drifted once through the cold. Far enough to mock. Close enough to wound. Mary's blood went cold. Elias did not chase it. He stood still. Breathing hard. Listening. Then he lowered the rifle and walked to the snow beside the shed. Something lay there near the outer wall. A burlap sack. Thrown clear of the flames. Mary followed him. Inside were strips of dried venison. Stolen from the cabin store. 2 salt bricks. And the small tin of coffee Elias used only on the bitterest mornings. Not random. Chosen. A message. They could have burned everything. Instead they had taken what winter could not spare. Elias looked down at the sack. Then at the hoof prints around the yard. 4 riders this time. 1 horse shod crooked on the left rear. Mary noticed it too. The print cut deeper on one side. He was here before, she said. Elias nodded once. The same horse that had circled the cabin days ago. The same men getting bolder. The fire burned itself lower by sunrise. What remained of the shed sagged inward in black ruin. The snow around it was gray slush. Water. Ash. Charred splinters. Mary stood near the porch wrapped in Elias's fur coat while smoke drifted thin into the pale morning. Elias knelt in the wreckage. Sorting through what was left. 1 trap salvaged. Then 2. A bent pan. A cracked lantern. Half a sack of meal, scorched but usable. He worked in silence. Steady. Methodical. Mary brought him a blanket for his burned shoulder. He did not take it. So she stepped behind him and laid it there anyway. His body went still under her hands. Just for a second. Then he let the blanket stay. She moved beside him without a word and started gathering nails from the ash. Usable ones into a tin cup. Crooked ones to the side. Work. Again. That was how people survived what wanted them broken. Near the back corner of the shed, Elias stopped. Something had been pinned into a post with a hunting knife. A strip of leather. Mary saw it and felt the air leave her lungs. Her chain. The one that had held the ring. Cut clean. The ring was gone. Elias rose slowly and pulled the knife free. Under the dangling leather, carved into the blackened post, were 3 rough words. Found our property. Mary stared at it. Then at the empty space against her throat. Her hand lifted there by instinct. Nothing. No ring. No chain. Only skin gone cold. Elias did not speak. He turned the knife once in his hand. Then drove it back into the post so deep the wood split. The sound cracked through the ruined yard. Mary looked at him. Really looked. At the smoke on his skin. The burn bright across one shoulder. The jaw set hard enough to break stone. Something had changed. Not in the fire. Not in the theft. In him. The mountain had been struck. And this time it had struck something he had begun to call his own. Morning found the cabin changed. Not broken. Changed. The black ribs of the burned shed stood in the snow behind it like old bones. Smoke still clung to the yard. The air smelled of wet ash and pine. Mary stepped onto the porch with a pail in her hand and stopped. Elias Boone was already at work. He had stripped off the scorched bandage from his shoulder. Fresh cloth wrapped the burn now. Tight. Clean. His rifle lay across the chopping block. His knife hung at his hip. A bedroll, rope, hatchet, and 3 sacks of provisions sat packed beside the door. Not for repair. For travel. Mary crossed the yard slowly. Snow crunched under her boots. "You're leaving." Elias drove an axe into a post and split it clean through. "One strike. Hard." "Rourke took the ring," he said. His voice was low. Flat. He marked the yard. "Another strike." Wood broke again. "He won't stop." Mary set the pail down. Wind moved a loose strand of hair across her cheek. "And if you go after him alone?" Elias bent and gathered the split pieces. "Then I go alone." The words landed like a closed door. Mary looked past him toward the white ridge above the valley. Toward the pass where Red Widow Notch waited under snow and stone. Then back at the packed bedroll. "You'll find his men." Elias tied the rope tighter around one sack. "Good." Mary stared at him. At the set of his jaw. At the silence he wore like armor. This was the man from the photograph gone cold. Not the one who carved spoons and repaired straps by firelight. The other one. The one Winter had buried but not killed. She stepped closer. "You go down there for revenge, you won't come back." Elias finally looked at her. Snowlight sharpened his eyes. "This ain't revenge." Mary almost answered. Then stopped. Because she heard the truth under the light. Not revenge alone. Not anymore. She followed his gaze to the door of the cabin. To the smoke curling from the chimney. To the place that had become something neither of them had named. He saw her see it. And that changed something. Small. But real. Elias lifted the rifle and checked the chamber. Then handed it to her. Mary blinked. The weight of the gun settled across her palms. "You bar the door after me," he said. "Keep the fire fed." He reached into his coat and set 2 spare cartridges on the porch rail. "If riders come, you shoot first." Mary held the rifle tighter. Cold metal. Warm wood. A command, not comfort. But beneath it lay trust. The first clear piece of it he had ever given her. She drew a slow breath. "I'm not staying behind." Elias turned back toward the gear. "You are." Mary set the rifle down against the rail and stepped in front of him. Close enough now to force his eyes to meet hers. "Red Widow Notch was in the words I heard." Her voice stayed calm. "Those men took me from that road. They stole the ring from my neck. They left that message on your post because they know I'm added to this." Elias tried to step around her. She did not move. "You don't know which trail they'll use from the Notch," she said. "I do." The yard went quiet. Only wind now. Only ash shifting in the snow. Elias looked down at her boots planted firm in the slush. Then at her face. No fear gone. But no weakness left either. Just resolve. He glanced toward the burn shed. Toward the broken supplies. Toward the carved words still black on the post. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not softer. Deeper. "You ride close. You do what I say?" Mary nodded once. Fast. Certain. That should have been enough. But Elias kept looking at her. As if testing whether the mountain itself approved. Then he turned, strode to the lean-to beside the cabin, and pulled away a hide cover. A mule stood there. Gray. Broad-backed. Winter tough. Mary stared. "You had a mule this whole time?" "Pack mule," Elias said. "Bad temper." The mule flicked an ear and stamped once. Mary almost smiled. Almost. They worked without more talk. He packed the blankets and salt. She wrapped bread in cloth and filled the waterskin. He lashed the hatchet and the trapline rope. She tucked the brass button and cartridge casing into the inside pocket of his coat. Evidence. Proof. More than proof now. A trail. Inside the cabin, Elias moved from wall to wall with deliberate hands. He took down extra shot. A skinning knife. The old hide map. Then he stopped at the shelf. The photograph stood where Mary had first found it. Dust gone now. Glass still cracked. He looked at it only a moment. Then set it face down. Not discarded. Not forgotten. Just laid to rest for what came next. Mary watched from the hearth. The fire warmed her back. The open door let cold spill in across the floor. Warmth and winter met at her boots. When Elias returned to the porch, he held out the fur coat. The dark one that usually rode his own shoulder. Wear it. Mary took it slowly. It's yours. So are they. He nodded toward the mountains. The trails. The danger. The choice. For a second the world narrowed to that. No storm. No outlaws. Just a man who had spent years living for nothing, placing his own protection on her shoulders. Mary pulled the coat on. It hung heavy and warm around her. His scent of pine smoke and cold air settled over her like shelter. Elias lifted the rifle from the rail and slung it across his back. Then he took the hunting knife from the post where he had buried it after the fire. The blade came free with a crack of splitting wood. He slid it into its sheath. The motion was quiet. Final. Mary led the mule into the yard. Elias stepped beside her and looked down the valley trail. White ridges. Blue shadow. A world that could kill the careless and hide the wicked. But not forever. He reached for the cabin door. Pulled it shut. Dropped the iron bar into place from the outside latch. Not abandoning home. Defending it by leaving. When he turned back, Mary was already standing at the trail with the mule's lead in hand. Ready. Not rescued now. Not carried. Ready. Elias Boone came to stand beside her. Broad. Burned. Silent. The mountain man who had hidden from grief now stepped into it on purpose. Not for a ring. Not for old ghosts. For the living woman beside him. For the cabin behind him. For the fragile thing they had built among snow and firelight. Then, without another word, he started down the trail. And Mary went with him. By the time Elias Boone and Mary Whitlock reached town, the snow had turned to black slush in the streets. Hoofprints cut deep between the buildings. Smoke rose from chimneys. Men moved slow under the gray sky. Then they saw who had come down from the mountain. Conversation stopped. Elias rode the mule in silence. Broad shoulders wrapped in weather and ash. Rifle across his back. Burn bandage showing white at the edge of his collar. Mary walked beside him in the dark fur coat, one gloved hand on the lead rope. Her face was pale from cold and lack of sleep. But steady. At the mule's side hung 2 saddlebags heavy with more than supplies. More than proof. The sheriff's office stood beside the mercantile. A plain board building with frost on the windows and mud on the porch steps. Sheriff Tom Weaver stepped out before they reached it. Big man. Gray mustache. Old cavalry stiffness still riding in his spine. He looked at Elias first. Then at Mary. Then at the saddlebags. His eyes narrowed. You bring weather down with you, Boone. Elias swung down from the mule. Boots hitting slush. Brought Rourke. That pulled the town tighter. The blacksmith stopped hammering. A woman on the boardwalk turned and stood still with her basket in both hands. Mary watched it happen. The way fear moved through people before truth even had a name. Inside the sheriff's office the stove burned hot. Wet wool steamed. Boot leather creaked. Elias set one saddlebag on the desk and opened it. Gold spilled out in dull yellow stacks. Coins. Small bars. Jewelry crusted with old dirt. The room went silent except for the hiss of the stove. Sheriff Weaver stared. Mary pulled a folded oilskin bundle from her coat and laid it beside the gold. The brass button. The spent cartridge casing. A torn ledger page from Red Widow Notch, taken from a dead firebox hidden under rock. Names. Freight dates. Amounts. Marks beside shipments that never reached their destination. Elias said nothing. He did not need to. Mary did the speaking. Clear. Measured. She told how the coach had been robbed. How the driver died. How the men boasted in the snow. How the ring had reached her neck. How the burned trading post matched the same riders. How the crooked horseshoe track had led from the cabin yard to the notch and back. Sheriff Weaver listened with both hands braced on the desk. Twice he glanced toward Elias, as if expecting the mountain man to break in. Elias never did. He stood near the wall like iron driven into timber. Mary finished and the office stayed quiet. Then Weaver unfolded the ledger page fully. His jaw hardened. "This mark here," he said, tapping a line with one finger, "belongs to the Danner Freight Company." Mary nodded. "The same company Caleb Rourke rode for before he turned outlaw." A voice came from the doorway. "That don't prove Rourke buried it." Everyone turned. Harlan Pike stood there in a clean coat and polished boots. Banker. Town councilman. A man who smiled too quickly and never touched dirt if he could help it. He stepped inside slow, bringing the cold with him. "Could be stolen by anyone," he said. "Gold in a sack don't hang a man." Mary saw Elias shift once. Not much. But enough. Like a wolf hearing brush move. Sheriff Weaver looked at Pike. "You come to warm your hands or interfere?" Pike gave a thin smile. "Just saying law needs more than mountain stories." Elias reached into the second saddlebag. Pulled out a rifle. Fine walnut stock. Silver notch on the barrel. He laid it on the desk without a word. Sheriff Weaver's face changed. He knew it. So did the blacksmith in the doorway behind Pike. "So help me," the blacksmith muttered, "that's Amos Reed's rifle." Mary looked from one man to the other. The blacksmith stepped inside. "Amos ran that trading shack by the creek. Been missing near a week." Elias nodded once. "We found his blood in the ruins." Pike's mouth tightened. Still he held his ground. A dead man's rifle still proves nothing. Mary had been waiting for that. She slipped her hand inside the fur coat and pulled free the ring. The one Rourke had stolen back from the burn shed. The one Elias had taken off Rourke's hand after the fight at the notch. Gold caught the stove light. The sheriff stared. Pike did too. Mary stepped closer to the desk. "Then prove you've never seen this." Pike's eyes flickered before he could stop them. Just a glance. Too quick for most. Not too quick for Mary. Not too quick for Elias. Sheriff Weaver saw it as well. His face went still. Mary set the ring beside the ledger. "The man at Red Widow Notch said the banker kept the books and the outlaw kept the guns." Pike laughed once. Short. Dry. "Now you're quoting dead thieves?" Elias finally moved. One step off the wall. Then another. He came to stand across from Pike, towering over him. Smoke and wind are still clinging to his coat. Burned scar pale against his neck. "You sold the freight routes," Elias said. His voice was low. Quiet. It carried more force than shouting would have. Pike's smile vanished. Elias pointed to the ledger marks. "You marked which wagons carried payroll. Then to the gold. Rourke took them. Then to the ring. And you fenced what couldn't be melted." The room filled. Townsmen now. A ranch wife. The barber still in his apron. Faces at the windows. Boots on the porch. Witnesses. Exactly what Fear hated most. Pike looked around and saw it too. The town had stopped being audience. It was becoming jury. He tried one last time. "You mountain fool," he snapped. "You think mud and rumor make a case?" Sheriff Weaver drew his revolver. The click froze the room. "No," he said. He nodded toward the ledger, the rifle, the stolen gold, the ring. "This does." Then Amos Reed himself appeared in the doorway. Bandaged. Pale. Alive. The whole office seemed to suck in air at once. The trader leaned on a crutch, eyes sunken but burning. He pointed straight at Pike. "That's the man who sent me to the crossing late." Then his gaze shifted to the ledger. "And that's my freight page he tore from my book." Pike broke. Not in words. In movement. He lunged for the door. Elias caught him by the coat collar before he took 2 steps. The banker left his feet like rotten timber ripped from a fence. He hit the floor hard. Sheriff Weaver was on him in a second. Handcuffs. Mud on the clean coat. The town watched. No gunshot. No grand speech. Just truth closing its hand. Mary stood very still beside the stove. Warmth on one side. Cold leaking in from the open door on the other. Elias looked at her across the room. Nothing spoken. Nothing needed. Around them the town began to murmur. Fear loosening. Justice spreading person to person like fire catching dry wood. And for the first time in years, the mountain had brought something down besides winter. It had brought the truth. Spring reached the mountain in pieces. First the dripping. Then the soft collapse of snow from the cabin roof. Then narrow seams of earth showing dark beneath the pines. Elias Boone stood in the yard with a hammer in one hand and a plank balanced against the new shed frame. Sun warmed his bare shoulders. The burn on one side had faded from angry red to pale pink. He drove the nail straight. One strike. Then another. The board settled tight. Behind him Mary Whitlock crossed the yard with an armful of split cedar. Her boots no longer dragged through the ground like a stranger's. She moved like someone who knew where the path curved. Where the porch creaked. Where the morning light hit first. She set the wood by the door and glanced toward the ridge. Water sang somewhere down the thawing creek. Birdsong had returned to the trees. The mountain no longer sounded empty. It sounded awake. Elias stepped down from the half-built wall and took the last plank from the stack. Mary handed him nails from a tin cup. Their fingers brushed once. Neither pulled away too fast. The small contact stayed in the air longer than a word. By midday the shed frame stood complete. Fresh timber. Straight lines. A roof ready for shingles. Not what had burned. Something stronger. Mary spread a cloth on the porch rail and laid out bread, smoked venison, and a jar of berry preserves the sheriff's wife had pressed into her hands before they left town. A thank you gift. Townfolk had sent others too. Coffee. Flour. A sack of seed potatoes. Not pity. Respect. Elias washed sawdust from his hands in the bucket and sat on the porch step. Mary poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Steam curled up between them. Warm. Dark. Rich. A mountain luxury. He took his cup. Looked out over the valley. The snow line had climbed higher. The trail to town showed through in brown bends now. Open. Passable. Mary followed his eyes. You could trade regular again, she said. Elias drank once before answering. Could. The word hung there. Not refusal. Not promise. Just possibility. Mary smiled faintly and tore bread in half. Down by the old post near the shed ruins, the cut mark from Rourke's knife had weathered pale. Rain and thaw had softened it. Time was doing its slow work. Later, Mary carried water from the creek while Elias set shingles on the new roof. The bucket was heavier than winter had once allowed. But she carried it steady. At the bank she stopped. Looked down into the clear water. Her reflection stared back. Stronger now. Cheeks no longer hollow. Fear no longer the first thing in her face. Around her neck hung a thin leather cord. The ring rested there again. Not hidden. Not like evidence. like memory given a gentler place. She touched it once, then climbed back toward the cabin. When she reached the yard, Elias had climbed down from the roof and stood beside the porch table. In his hand was the old photograph. The cracked one. The younger man. The woman beside him. Mary slowed. Elias looked at the picture a long moment. Wind moved softly through the pines. No storm in it now. Only spring. Then he carried the photograph into the cabin. Mary followed to the doorway and watched him place it on the shelf. Not at the center. Not turned face down. Set with care beside the wooden box. Beside the burned lace. A place among what remained. A place of honor. A place of peace. He closed the box. Not hiding the past. Just laying it gently where it belonged. Mary stood in the warm doorway, one hand on the frame. Firelight from the hearth moved across the floor, though the day was bright enough without it. Elias turned toward her. For a second neither spoke. The cabin held that silence the way only a real home can. Not empty. Full. He crossed the room and took the water bucket from her hand. Set it down. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A carved piece of smooth bone. Light-colored. Simple. A mountain pendant. Newly drilled for a cord. He held it out. Mary looked from the pendant to him. "For what?" she asked softly. Elias glanced toward the ring resting against her throat. "Needs company." Mary let out a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. Almost became tears too. She took the pendant from his hand. Bone warmed by his pocket. By his body. By intention. He stepped behind her and tied it beside the ring on the cord. His hands were careful. Large. Rough. Gentle where they touched the back of her neck. When he stepped away, the two small things rested together at her throat. Golden bone. Loss and survival. Past and future. Outside, the mule brayed from the lean-to. Impatient for feed. Mary smiled for real this time and wiped quickly at one eye before the tear could fall. Work waited. Always. That was part of peace too. By evening the new shed roof was finished. The last light spread gold over wet ground and pine bark. Inside the cabin, stew simmered over the fire. The good spoon Elias had carved rested beside Mary's bowl. The room smelled of cedar smoke, broth, and fresh bread warming near the hearth. Elias sat at the table mending a harness strap. Mary shelled dried beans into a crock. Simple sounds filled the room. Leather creak. Beans tapping clay. Fire settling into coals. No one had to force conversation. It came when it came. It rested when it rested. The mountain beyond the walls turned blue with dusk. Safe now. Not harmless. Never that. But no longer ruled by ghosts. After supper Elias stepped outside one last time. Mary joined him on the porch. The valley opened below them in soft shadow. Creek water flashed silver through the thaw. A lamp glowed inside the cabin behind them. Warm light through clean glass. Home light. Mary slipped her hand into his. Not asking. Not trembling. Just there. Elias looked down once. Then closed his fingers around hers. Strong. Certain. Together they stood in the cool spring air while swallows dipped over the yard and the first stars came out above the ridge. Behind them waited firelight. Food. Work for tomorrow. A life rebuilt board by board. And ahead of them, for the first time in many years, the mountain held more than memory. It held a future. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.